The doppelganger phenomenon, meeting yourself from another timeline. There are accounts scattered through history and across cultures of people, encountering exact duplicates of themselves, seeing their own face on a stranger's body, watching themselves walk past in crowds, receiving reports from multiple witnesses that they were seen in locations they never visited, experiencing the profound disorientation of confronting what appears to be themselves but isn't, what looks identical but is separate, what shares every physical characteristic but exists independently. Traditionally, these were interpreted as supernatural omens, as harbingers of death or misfortune, as spiritual phenomena suggesting the soul had left the body or that death was approaching. But there's an interpretation that's gained traction in an era of quantum physics and multiverse theories, an explanation that transforms doppelgangers from supernatural entities into dimensional travelers, into versions of yourself from parallel timelines who have somehow crossed into our reality, who exist here simultaneously with you because the barriers between universes have temporarily failed or have been deliberately breached, making doppelganger encounters not hallucinations or evil twins or spiritual warnings, but actual meetings between alternate versions of the same person, between the you who made certain choices and the you who made different choices, between the timeline where you went left and the timeline where you went right, between quantum branches that normally remain separate, but that under certain conditions can overlap, can intersect, can allow travelers to cross from one probable reality into another, bringing them face to face with themselves as they might have been, as they are, in worlds adjacent to this one, creating encounters that are philosophically and psychologically devastating. Because what do you say to yourself? How do you react to meeting the person you could have been? How do you process the fact that alternate versions of you exist and that you're now sharing space with one, that the multiverse isn't theoretical, but is physically present in the form of your own face, looking back at you with recognition or confusion or horror equal to your own, two versions of the same person encountering each other across dimensional boundaries that should have kept them forever separate, forever ignorant of each other's existence, but that have failed or been breached, leaving both of you confronting the reality that you're not unique, that identity is less singular than you believed, that the choices you made that define who you are were also not made in another timeline where a different version of you chose differently and became someone else who nonetheless shares your face, your body, your memories, up to the point of divergence, making doppelganger encounters not supernatural but hypernatural, not impossible, but simply requiring physics we don't yet fully understand, physics of branching timelines and quantum probability and dimensional barriers that are permeable under conditions we haven't identified, leaving us with reports of people meeting themselves, of encounters between alternate selves, of doppelgangers who aren't demons or omens, but are literally you from another world, another time, another set of choices that led to the same person, but different life, different outcomes, different versions of the same identity existing simultaneously across the multiverse, and occasionally, impossibly. Meeting in moments that challenge everything we believe about uniqueness and selfhood, and the nature of personal identity that we assume is singular when the multiverse suggests it's plural, that there are many yous across many worlds, and that sometimes, under conditions we don't control and don't understand, those many yous can see each other, can meet each other, can confront the disturbing reality that you are not one but many, that your identity is distributed across quantum branches, and that the doppelganger you encounter might be yourself from a world where everything went differently, where the fork in the road led to different destination, where you made different choices that created different person who nonetheless is you, creating encounters that neither folklore nor science has adequate frameworks for understanding, leaving doppelganger phenomenon suspended between supernatural interpretation that no longer satisfies in materialist age and scientific interpretation that requires physics we don't yet possess, between omen and actuality, between hallucination and dimensional crossing, between impossible and merely unexplained. The historical accounts of doppelgangers are extensive and cross-cultural. The German word doppelganger means double walker or double goer, and German folklore is particularly rich with accounts of these phenomena. But similar concepts exist globally. The fetch in Irish folklore, the caw in ancient Egyptian belief, the Vardøger in Scandinavian tradition. Various concepts across indigenous cultures of spiritual doubles or alternate selves that can manifest separately from the physical body. The common thread is the appearance of someone who looks exactly like you but isn't you, who exists independently, who can be seen by others, even when you're elsewhere, creating situations where your presence is reported in multiple locations simultaneously, or where you encounter your own reflection walking towards you as if it were a separate person. The experiential accounts from modern times continue to accumulate. People report seeing themselves across streets, in crowds, in photographs from locations they never visited. They receive messages from friends asking why they didn't acknowledge them at places they never were. They encounter strangers who insist they've met before, who have detailed memories of interactions that never occurred, suggesting the stranger actually met an alternate version of them, a doppelganger who exists in this timeline and who has been living a parallel life, creating confusion, creating proof that duplicates exist, that identity is not as unique as we assume. The most disturbing accounts involve direct face-to-face encounters. The person sees themselves, makes eye contact with themselves, experiences the profound cognitive dissonance of their brain, trying to process visual input that shouldn't be possible, seeing your own face on someone else, watching yourself from external perspective, confronting the reality that you are simultaneously the observer and the observed, the self and the other. These encounters typically last moments before one party flees or the doppelganger vanishes, leaving the witness with experience that's impossible to explain satisfactorily through normal frameworks, that challenges their understanding of reality and identity in ways that persist long after the encounter ends. The quantum physics interpretation draws on many worlds or multiverse theories. In the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, every quantum event creates branching timelines where all possible outcomes occur, each in a separate universe. You exist in all of these branches. In one, you made one choice. In another, you made a different choice. In countless parallel worlds, countless versions of you are living lives that diverged at every decision point, every random quantum event that affected your trajectory. Normally, these parallel yous exist in separate universes, with no interaction, no awareness of each other. But if the barriers between universes are permeable, if under certain conditions dimensional boundaries can weaken or fail, then perhaps occasionally alternate versions can cross over, can manifest in timelines that aren't their own, appearing as doppelgangers, as duplicates, as alternate selves. The mechanism by which this crossing might occur isn't specified by current physics. Quantum mechanics describes the branching, but doesn't provide pathways for travel between branches. The barriers between timelines, if they exist, aren't understood. What conditions might allow crossing, what energy requirements or technologies or accidents might create dimensional portals, remains entirely speculative. But the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics doesn't forbid it, doesn't contain principles that make intertimeline travel definitively impossible, leaving it as theoretical possibility that might be achievable under conditions we don't yet understand or haven't yet encountered. The psychological impact of doppelganger encounters is severe because they violate fundamental assumptions about selfhood. We experience ourselves as unique individuals, as the only version of ourselves that exists. Encountering evidence that this isn't true, that other yous exist, that identity is replicated across timelines, creates existential crisis. Who are you if you're not unique? What does it mean to be you if there are other yous? Are they you, or are they separate people who happen to be identical? The philosophical questions about personal identity that academic philosophy treats as abstract thought experiments become viscerally real when you're standing face to face with yourself, when you can't dismiss it as theoretical because it's directly in front of you, making eye contact, existing. The divergence point becomes a crucial question. How far back did your timelines separate? Is your doppelganger you from moment ago, from timeline that branched seconds before, making them virtually identical to you in every way, except the immediate circumstances that allowed dimensional crossing? Or did your timelines diverge years or decades ago, making the doppelganger someone who shares your origin, but who has lived substantially different life, who has become different person through different experiences despite identical starting point? The degree of similarity or difference between you and your alternate self affects the nature of the encounter. Meeting yourself from 1 second ago might be like looking in perfect mirror, while meeting yourself from 20 years of divergence might be like meeting a stranger who happens to have your exact face, your memories from childhood, but completely different adult life. The evidence problems are severe. Doppelganger encounters are brief, often private, rarely photographed or documented in ways that could be verified. The witness's own testimony is all that exists, and testimony about seeing yourself is inherently suspect because it sounds like hallucination, like psychological disturbance, like the kind of experience that suggests mental health issues rather than dimensional phenomena. Even when multiple witnesses report seeing the same person in 2 locations simultaneously. Coordinating their reports and verifying timeline details proves difficult, leaving most doppelganger accounts as anecdotal reports that can't be rigorously investigated or confirmed. The mistaken identity explanation accounts for many reported doppelgangers. Humans aren't as unique looking as we tend to believe. Statistical analysis suggests that for any given person, several other people exist globally who resemble them closely enough to be mistaken for them by casual observers. These lookalikes aren't perfect duplicates, but in certain lighting, at certain distances, from certain angles, they can appear identical, creating situations where friends report seeing you somewhere you weren't, where you glimpse someone who looks remarkably like you, where the superficial resemblance is interpreted as exact duplication when closer inspection would reveal differences. The millions of people on Earth make it statistically likely that close lookalikes exist for most people, removing the need for supernatural or dimensional explanations. But this doesn't account for the cases where the resemblance is too perfect, where not just general appearance, but specific details match exactly, where mannerisms and voice and characteristics beyond mere physical features are identical, where the doppelganger isn't just someone who looks like you, but is someone who is you in every observable way. These cases, if accurately reported, require explanation beyond statistical lookalikes, require either fraud, staged encounters, elaborate hoaxes, or actual phenomena that produces perfect duplicates through mechanisms that normal biology doesn't include. The time slip interpretation proposes that some doppelganger encounters involve temporal rather than dimensional crossing, that you're encountering yourself from different point in time rather than from alternate timeline. Perhaps the doppelganger is you from the future who has traveled back, or you from the past who traveled forward, creating situation where 2 temporal versions of the same person exist in the same timeline simultaneously for a brief period, appearing as doppelgangers to each other and to observers. This requires time travel rather than dimensional travel, but might be related if time and dimension are connected. If moving between timelines also involves temporal displacement, if the physics that permits one also permits the other. The spiritual interpretations remain culturally embedded despite scientific frameworks. In many traditions, seeing your doppelganger is omen of death, suggesting that the soul has partially separated from the body in preparation for final departure, that you're seeing your own death approaching in form of your double. Others interpret it as astral projection gone wrong, the spiritual body manifesting separately from physical body and becoming visible to the physical self, creating uncanny encounter between your physical and spiritual aspects. These interpretations don't require parallel timelines or dimensional travel, instead invoking metaphysical dualism where humans have both physical and spiritual components that can, under certain conditions, exist separately. The glitch in the matrix interpretation, popular in simulation theory communities, suggests doppelgangers are rendering errors, moments where the simulation we're living in accidentally generates duplicate instances of the same person, or where anti-aliasing fails, and you briefly see yourself as you appear in the simulation's code, or where different layers of the simulation overlap, making entities from separate layers briefly visible to each other. This doesn't invoke parallel timelines, but rather parallel instances within a single simulated reality, making doppelgangers artifacts of computational rather than physical reality. The terror associated with doppelganger encounters makes sense regardless of which explanation is correct. Seeing yourself violates expectations so fundamental that the experience is inherently disturbing. Your brain expects that when you see your own face, it will be in mirror or photograph, in reflection, not an external, independent entity. When that expectation is violated, when you see your face on something that moves independently, that exists separately from you, the cognitive dissonance creates immediate fear response. This might be why doppelganger folklore is uniformly negative, why encounters are treated as omens of misfortune. The experience is so disturbing that humans have consistently interpreted it as threatening, regardless of whether any actual threat is present. The question of what happens if you interact with your doppelganger is addressed differently across different theoretical frameworks. In quantum mechanical terms, if the doppelganger is from another timeline, interaction might create paradoxes, similar to time travel paradoxes if information transfer occurs. What you learn from your alternate self about their timeline might affect your decisions, might change your timeline, might create feedback loops. In simulation theory, interaction might trigger error correction, might cause the simulation to resolve the duplicate by eliminating one instance. In spiritual frameworks, interaction with your double might hasten death, might cause soul fragmentation, might create imbalance that has negative consequences. Most accounts suggest intuitive avoidance. Witnesses flee from their doppelgangers, feel compelled to avoid interaction, sense that engagement would be dangerous, even if they can't articulate why. The relationship between doppelgangers and Mandela effect is worth noting. Both phenomena suggest reality might be less stable than we assume, that the past or parallel timelines can affect the present in detectable ways. If Mandela effect represents memories from alternate timelines bleeding through, and doppelgangers represent people from alternate timelines crossing over, they might be related phenomena, different manifestations of the same underlying dimensional permeability, different types of evidence that the multiverse isn't just mathematical abstraction, but is physically real and occasionally intersects with our experienced reality in ways we can't control, but that we can observe when they occur. The prevention or control of doppelganger encounters doesn't exist in any documented form. These aren't events people can trigger deliberately or avoid through conscious action. They happen spontaneously, often in mundane circumstances, without warning or apparent cause. If they represent dimensional crossing, the conditions that permit crossing aren't understood well enough to predict or prevent them. If they represent natural phenomena, lookalikes, hallucinations, temporal slips, they're random enough that individual protection isn't possible. The lack of control adds to the disturbing nature of reports. You can't prevent encountering your doppelganger, can't prepare for it, can't predict when or where it might occur, leaving you vulnerable to experience that will fundamentally challenge your understanding of identity and reality whenever it happens to occur, if it occurs. Whether doppelgangers are alternate selves from parallel timelines, temporal duplicates from time travel, spiritual phenomena involving soul separation, simulation glitches, statistical lookalikes, or psychological hallucinations, the reports continue, the encounters continue. The human experience of seeing ourselves as if we were other continues to disturb and fascinate and challenge our assumptions about uniqueness and identity and the nature of the self that we experience as singular. But that might be plural, that might exist in multiple forms across multiple realities, that might occasionally encounter itself when dimensional boundaries fail or weaken, creating moments where the multiverse becomes personal, becomes visible, becomes undeniable in form of your own face, looking back at you with the recognition that comes from seeing yourself and the horror that comes from seeing yourself from outside, from being simultaneously subject and object, observer and observed, the one who sees and the one who is seen, creating experience that breaks the normal unity of selfhood, that reveals identity as less stable than we believe, that proves or suggests that you are not one but many, that the person you are exists in multiple versions across multiple worlds, and that sometimes, impossibly, those versions can meet, can see each other, can confront the reality that the uniqueness we assume is fiction, that identity is distributed across probability space, across quantum branches, across the multiverse that generates infinite variations of every person, making each of us simultaneously unique in our specific timeline and replicated infinitely across all possible timelines, leaving doppelganger phenomenon as either the most disturbing quantum mechanical effect, proving that parallels exist and can cross into this reality, or as persistent human experience that combines lookalikes with psychological projection and cultural interpretation to create encounters that feel significant even when they're statistically normal, leaving us wondering when we glimpse someone who looks like us, whether we're seeing a stranger who happens to resemble us, or whether we're seeing ourselves from another world, another timeline, another set of choices that led to the same person living different life. Wondering if they wonder the same, if they recognize us, if they know what we are to them and what they are to us, if they understand that we're the same person separated by quantum branching, or by dimensional boundaries, or by the multiverse that generates all possible versions of every one, making doppelgangers either the most profound proof that identity is plural and that reality is far stranger than common sense suggests, or the most persistent misinterpretation of normal lookalikes and cognitive errors, depending on which explanation you accept, which framework you use to interpret the encounters that people continue to report, continue to experience, continue to find disturbing and challenging and impossible to forget. The moment when you see yourself and realize you're not alone, not unique, not singular, but are one of many, one of infinite, one version among countless versions of the same person, meeting yourself across the dimensional divide, across the timeline separation, across whatever barrier usually keeps the alternate yous separate and hidden from each other, veiled temporarily, breached momentarily, allowing the doppelganger encounter that proves either that the multiverse is real and accessible, or that human experience is far more prone to illusion and error than we'd like to believe, leaving the phenomenon permanently ambiguous permanently unsettling, permanently suspended between explanation frameworks that are all insufficient, that all fail to capture the full strangeness of encountering yourself, of meeting the person who is you but isn't you, who shares your identity but exists separately, who is doppelganger, double, alternate self, timeline variant, quantum duplicate, or merely stranger who looks like you, depending on what you believe, what you experience, what you discover when you encounter yourself, and have to decide in that moment whether you're meeting yourself from another world, or whether you're hallucinating, or whether you're simply seeing a look-alike, and your brain is constructing significance from coincidence, leaving the doppelganger phenomenon as permanent mystery, permanent challenge to singular identity, permanent suggestion that the you reading this might not be the only you, might be one of many, might someday encounter another. And when you do, you'll have to decide what it means, who they are, who you are in relation to them, whether you're meeting yourself or meeting a stranger, whether. Identity is singular or plural, whether you're alone in your selfhood, or whether infinite versions of you exist across infinite timelines, occasionally glimpsing each other through dimensional cracks, through quantum overlaps, through doppelganger encounters that reveal. The multiverse is not theoretical, but actual, not abstract, but personal, not impossible, but merely rare, waiting for the moment when you turn a corner and see yourself walking toward you. When you look up and catch your own eyes looking back, when you encounter the doppelganger and discover whether they're you from another timeline or whether they're something else entirely, something the theories haven't accounted for, something stranger than parallel selves, something that makes the doppelganger phenomenon not quantum mechanics and not hallucination, but something we lack frameworks to understand, something that exists in the gaps between our explanations, between our physics and our psychology, between the possible and the impossible, where doppelgangers live, where alternate selves wait, where encounters happen that challenge everything we believe about identity and uniqueness and the singular nature of the self that might be more plural than we've ever imagined, more distributed than we've ever acknowledged, more strange than any theory has yet managed to capture. Targeted individuals, people claiming constant surveillance and harassment. There's a growing community of people across the world who share a disturbing set of experiences they claim are ruining their lives. They report being under constant surveillance by unknown agencies or groups, experiencing electronic harassment through technologies they can't identify, hearing voices or sounds that no one else perceives, finding evidence that their homes have been entered and items moved or tampered with while they were away, and suffering coordinated harassment from strangers in public who seem to be following scripts designed to intimidate or destabilize them psychologically. They call themselves targeted individuals, or TIs, and they've found each other through online communities where thousands share remarkably similar stories, despite living in different countries, having different backgrounds, and claiming to have no connection to each other before becoming targeted. The phenomenon raises profoundly difficult questions about the nature of their experiences. Are these people victims of sophisticated, organized harassment campaigns, using advanced surveillance technology, or are they experiencing shared delusions, patterns of mental illness that manifest in similar ways across different individuals because of common psychological mechanisms and the reinforcement effects of online communities where people validate each other's paranoid beliefs? The answer matters enormously, both for how we respond to their suffering and for what their experiences might reveal about surveillance capabilities, psychological warfare techniques, or the nature of certain mental health conditions in the digital age. The typical TI narrative follows certain patterns. The targeting often begins suddenly, sometimes after a specific incident that the person identifies as triggering: whistleblowing, political activism, a conflict with an employer or neighbor, or sometimes with no identifiable cause at all. They begin noticing things, strangers who appear repeatedly in different locations, vehicles that seem to follow them, people on the street who make gestures or comments that feel directed at them, technology behaving strangely in ways that suggest remote manipulation. The harassment escalates over time, becoming more overt and more distressing, expanding from street theater, the term TIs use for coordinated public harassment, into their homes through electronic means, through neighbors who participate in noise campaigns, or through wall harassment, through voice-to-skull technology that they claim can project sounds or voices directly into their heads. The consistency of reports across the TI community is striking. People who've never communicated before, discovering the community, describe identical types of harassment, organized stalking by groups of people, vehicles with specific colors following them, strangers coughing or making clicking sounds as they pass, directed energy weapons causing pain or illness, V2K, or voice-to-skull transmissions that sound like thoughts, but that the individual recognizes as external. The similarity could indicate that these are real tactics being deployed, that there's an actual playbook for psychological operations that multiple agencies or groups are using against targeted populations. Or the similarity could reflect the way certain mental illnesses manifest, patterns that repeat because human psychology and neurology produce consistent symptoms, with the internet allowing people experiencing these symptoms to find each other and collectively develop a shared framework that interprets their experiences through the targeting narrative rather than through mental health frameworks. The technology TIs describe being used against them includes real systems that exist in documented form alongside alleged capabilities that aren't publicly confirmed. Directed energy weapons, lasers, microwave emitters, acoustic devices, are real technologies with military and law enforcement applications. Active denial systems that use millimeter waves to create intense heat sensation have been developed for crowd control. Long-range AIG, acoustic devices can project painful sound at specific targets. These technologies demonstrate that remote influence and harassment is technically possible, though the miniaturized, portable versions that TIs claim are being used against them in residential settings aren't commercially available or easily accessible. Voice-to-skull technology is more controversial. The Frey effect, where microwave pulses can create audible perception directly in the human head, is real and documented science. Patents exist for technologies that could theoretically project sound to specific individuals. But whether functional, targetable, long-range V2K systems exist that could be deployed against civilians without massive, obvious equipment is disputed. TIs claim to experience voices, sounds, or synthetic thoughts that feel externally generated, but these symptoms also match descriptions of auditory hallucinations associated with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, creating an evidentiary problem where the claimed harassment and the symptoms of certain mental illnesses produce indistinguishable, subjective experiences. The surveillance that TIs report ranges from plausible to implausible. Being followed, having one's communications monitored, having GPS tracked. These are all technically feasible and have been documented in stalking cases, corporate espionage, and government surveillance programs. But TIs also claim capabilities that strain credibility. Real-time tracking regardless of precautions, reading thoughts or subvocalizations, seeing through walls to monitor activity inside homes, manipulating dreams or memories. Either surveillance technology is far more advanced than publicly acknowledged, or the perception of surveillance exceeds its actual scope, with the psychological state of believing you're being watched creating hypervigilance that interprets normal events as evidence of monitoring. The organized stalking or gang stalking component describes coordinated harassment by multiple people, acting in concert to destabilize the target. In documented cases, organized stalking has occurred. Domestic abuse situations where an abuser mobilizes friends and family to harass a victim. Corporate campaigns against whistleblowers, or harassment by extremist groups. These real instances demonstrate that coordinated group harassment happens. But TIs typically describe operations involving dozens or hundreds of participants, strangers who've been recruited or hired to follow them, neighbors who've been induced to participate in harassment campaigns, and infrastructure that seems implausibly large and well-coordinated to sustain against individuals who often aren't prominent or threatening, in ways that would justify such resource expenditure. The psychological perspective identifies targeted individual experiences as consistent with persecutory delusions, a category of symptoms appearing in schizophrenia, delusional disorder, and other conditions. These disorders can produce absolute conviction that one is being surveilled and harassed despite lack of objective evidence, can create interpretation patterns where ambiguous events are coded as intentional harassment, and can generate auditory hallucinations that the person experiences as external communication rather than internal generation. The internet and TI communities then provide validation and elaborate framework that reinforces these beliefs, makes the person less likely to seek psychiatric help, and deepens the conviction that their experiences are real and externally generated, rather than symptoms requiring treatment. But dismissing all TI reports as mental illness is problematic for several reasons. First, it's patronizing and potentially gaslighting. If someone is experiencing genuine harassment and reporting, it produces psychiatric diagnosis. Rather than investigation, the system becomes another tool of their victimization. Second, we know from declassified programs like COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and various surveillance abuses that governments have conducted operations against civilians that included psychological warfare, harassment, and experimentation. Dismissing all claims as delusion could mean missing real victims of continuing programs. Third, the diagnosis of delusion itself can be circular. The person claims they're being harassed. Investigators find no evidence, therefore they must be delusional. But lack of found evidence doesn't prove absence of harassment, given how sophisticated surveillance and psychological operations could be. The challenge of helping TIs is significant, regardless of whether their experiences stem from external harassment or internal psychological conditions. If they're genuinely being targeted, they need protection and investigation. If they're experiencing mental health crises, they need treatment. But TIs typically resist psychiatric framing of their experiences, having often tried to report their harassment to police or other authorities, and been dismissed or referred for mental health evaluation, which they interpret as the system colluding with their harassers. The online TI community actively discourages members from accepting mental health diagnoses or treatment, framing psychiatry as part of the targeting apparatus, which prevents those who might benefit from treatment from receiving it. The suffering is real, regardless of cause. TIs describe lives destroyed by their experiences, lost jobs because they couldn't function, or because they accused coworkers of being harassers, destroyed relationships because family and friends don't believe them, or are themselves accused of participating in the targeting. Constant fear and hypervigilance that prevents rest or normalcy. In some cases, suicide because the harassment becomes unbearable. Whether the harassment is external or the suffering stems from untreated mental illness, producing these terrible experiences, the pain is genuine and the impact on quality of life is devastating. There are also documented edge cases that complicate clean categorization. Instances where surveillance that seemed paranoid was later proven real. corporate espionage victims who were dismissed as paranoid before evidence emerged of actual monitoring. Abuse victims whose claims of organized harassment by their ex-partner's network were validated by evidence. These cases demonstrate that what appears to be paranoid delusion can sometimes be accurate assessment of actual threat, creating an ethical imperative not to reflexively dismiss all claims as illness. The question of motive, why would anyone target ordinary individuals with such elaborate harassment, is where many skeptical assessments focus. TIs often can't identify why they're valuable targets, why resources would be expended to harass them. Some propose they're being used as test subjects for perfecting psychological warfare techniques, that they're random selections meant to develop and refine methods that will later be used more broadly. Others suggest blacklists or algorithmic selection, where people get flagged for characteristics that trigger targeting, even if they don't understand what made them targets. Without clear motive, the harassment seems purposeless, which supports the mental health interpretation. But intelligence and military operations don't always have obvious motives from outside perspectives, and test programs by their nature wouldn't target people for strategic reasons, but for experimental reasons. The ethical approach involves taking claims seriously enough to investigate when possible, providing resources for protection if evidence of actual harassment exists, while also ensuring access to mental health support without forcing it on people against their will or using psychiatric diagnosis as a weapon to discredit legitimate complaints. This balance is difficult to achieve in practice. Law enforcement typically finds no evidence to support TI claims and doesn't have resources to provide indefinite protection based on unprovable allegations. Mental health services can't force treatment on people who refuse it unless they meet criteria for involuntary commitment. Support organizations often aren't equipped to handle the complexity of cases where harassment might be real, might be delusional, or might be some combination that doesn't fit clean categories. The TI phenomenon also serves as a lens for examining surveillance society and the psychological effects of living under actual widespread monitoring. We know our digital communications are surveilled by corporations and governments, that algorithms track and predict our behavior, that cameras and sensors record our movements through public spaces. This real surveillance could create conditions where people who are more sensitive to these intrusions or who have psychological vulnerabilities interpret the ambient surveillance as targeted personal harassment, mistaking the general panopticon for specific persecution. Or the real surveillance infrastructure might occasionally be weaponized against individuals in ways that produce TI experiences, with most dismissals of their claims serving to hide the minority of cases where targeting is actually occurring. What remains clear is that thousands of people globally identify as targeted individuals, share remarkably consistent descriptions of harassment and surveillance, suffer real distress from their experiences, and struggle to find help or validation in systems that either dismiss them as delusional or lack resources to investigate their claims. Whether they're victims of sophisticated psychological operations that most people never become aware of, whether they're experiencing symptoms of mental illness that present in culturally specific ways shaped by surveillance society and shared online narratives, or whether the truth involves some complex interaction between real harassment and psychological vulnerability. Where both exist but are difficult to disentangle, the phenomenon represents significant suffering and raises important questions about surveillance, mental health, and how we respond when people report experiences that seem implausible, but that can't be definitively disproven, and that cause obvious harm to those experiencing them. The targeted individual community continues to grow online, continues to share stories and strategies, continues to document their harassment, and support each other through experiences that isolate them from friends and family who don't believe them. They deserve compassion regardless of whether their experiences stem from external harassment or internal illness, and they deserve serious engagement with their claims rather than reflexive dismissal, even when those claims seem to exceed credible possibility. Because the cost of being wrong, of dismissing genuine victims as delusional, or of enabling mental illness by validating delusions, is high in both directions, leaving us with a phenomenon that resists easy resolution, that challenges our frameworks for understanding both surveillance capabilities and mental health, and that will likely persist as technology advances and as online communities continue to provide spaces where people experiencing these symptoms can find others who share their reality, validating experiences that the broader society refuses to acknowledge or believe. The Anjikuni Lake disappearance, an entire village vanished. In November 1930, according to accounts that emerged decades later, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle arrived at a small Inuit village near Anjikuni Lake in the Kavalik region of Nunavut, Canada, a settlement he had visited many times before, where he expected to find the usual welcome of a functioning community, going about their daily survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Instead, he found emptiness that defied explanation. The village was completely abandoned, not in the gradual way communities sometimes decline and disperse, but suddenly and recently, as if every resident had simultaneously stopped whatever they were doing and vanished. Fires had burned down to embers in the homes, suggesting recent occupation. Food was still cooking or prepared for meals, indicating people had been interrupted mid-activity. Rifles, which in that environment were essential survival tools that no one would willingly abandon, remained in the dwellings. Kayaks, necessary for transportation and fishing, were still tied at the shore. Sled dogs, crucial for winter survival, were found dead, not from violence, but from starvation, tied to their posts and left to die as if their owners had disappeared without warning or concern. For the animals that depended on them for life, as much as the owners depended on the dogs. Between 30 and 2,000 people, depending on which version of the story you encounter, had simply ceased to exist in this location, leaving behind all their possessions and provisions, leaving behind a functioning village that had become a ghost town. Overnight, for reasons that were never explained, never investigated thoroughly enough to produce official conclusions, and that remain one of the most disturbing mass disappearance cases in North American history, if it actually happened, because the evidence for the Anjikuni Lake disappearance is frustratingly ambiguous. Mixing documented facts with folklore embellishment, combining indigenous oral traditions with journalist exaggeration, creating a story that might be entirely true or partially fabricated or completely fictional, leaving us unable to determine whether an entire village actually vanished in circumstances that suggest abduction, disaster, or something beyond conventional explanation, or whether the story itself is the phenomenon, a narrative that emerged from the northern wilderness and achieved legendary status despite questionable historical foundation. The primary account comes from Joe LaBelle, the fur trapper, who allegedly reported the disappearance to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, triggering an investigation that supposedly found the village exactly as he described, abandoned, with possessions intact, with no signs of struggle or violence, with no indication of where the inhabitants had gone or why they would leave their essential survival equipment behind. But the historical records of this RCMP investigation are elusive at best, possibly lost or destroyed, possibly never thoroughly documented, or possibly non-existent because the investigation never happened in the form the legends describe. The first detailed published account appeared years after the alleged event, in articles by writer Frank Edwards, who specialized in paranormal and unexplained phenomena, who presented the Anjikuni case as documented fact, but whose sources and verification methods weren't rigorous by journalistic or historical standards, who may have been reporting an actual event, or may have been embellishing or fabricating, based on fragmentary rumors and indigenous legends about disappearances in the Northern Territories. The geographical challenges complicate investigation. The Kavalik region is vast, remote, sparsely populated even now, and was far more inaccessible in 1930. Anjikuni Lake exists. It's a real location in Nunavut, but identifying which specific settlement allegedly disappeared is problematic because Inuit communities in that era were often seasonal or semi-nomadic, moving with hunting and fishing opportunities, not always maintaining permanent year-round villages in fixed locations. A community might abandon a settlement for entirely normal reasons, following caribou migrations, relocating to better fishing, consolidating with other groups for winter survival. And to an outsider unfamiliar with these patterns, the abandoned site might appear mysterious when it was actually routine adaptation to environment and circumstance. The population numbers vary wildly across different tellings, from 30 to several hundred, to the implausible 2,000 that some accounts claim. Variations that suggest either confusion about which community or event is being described, or progressive exaggeration as the story was retold across decades. 2,000 people vanishing would be a catastrophic event that absolutely would have generated extensive investigation and documentation, regardless of the location's remoteness. 30 people from a small seasonal camp relocating would be entirely unremarkable and might not generate any official notice at all, particularly in that era when Indigenous communities in remote Canada weren't always closely monitored or recorded by colonial authorities. The dead sled dogs are among the most disturbing elements, if accurate. Inuit relationships with sled dogs were intimate and essential. These animals were survival tools, companions, transportation, and hunting aids that were treated with the care that critical equipment receives. Leaving them tied and unfed until they starved violates not just practical survival logic, but cultural values about animal treatment and responsibility. If the dogs were found dead as described, it suggests either sudden catastrophic event that prevented anyone from returning to care for them, or it suggests fabrication because the detail is so implausible from cultural and practical perspectives that its inclusion might indicate someone unfamiliar with actual Inuit practices inventing dramatic details. The theories about what happened, if anything happened, range across familiar territory. Abduction by unknown parties, though the logistics of abducting an entire community in remote Arctic environment without evidence and without any survivors or witnesses seem implausible. Mass death from disease or contamination, though this should have left bodies and should have been investigated given the public health implications. Voluntary relocation that appeared sudden to the outsider observer, but was actually planned by the community for reasons they had no obligation to communicate to visiting trappers. Natural disaster like sudden flooding, ice breakage, or other environmental event that killed or dispersed the population, though the intact possessions and structures argue against violent environmental catastrophe. Massacre or violence from hostile groups, though again the absence of bodies and destruction argues against this. Supernatural or paranormal explanations involving portals, alien abduction, dimensional shifts, or other exotic possibilities that can't be disproven, but that require extraordinary evidence that isn't available. The cultural dimension is significant. Indigenous communities across the Arctic and subarctic have oral traditions about disappearances, about people who went into the wilderness and never returned, about spirits or entities that take people, about places where reality behaves strangely. These traditions likely reflect real incidents, individuals getting lost and dying of exposure, small groups disappearing due to accidents or violence or starvation, that were interpreted through cultural frameworks that included supernatural explanations. The Anjikuni disappearance might be a specific historical event that was absorbed into this tradition, might be multiple separate incidents collapsed into a single narrative, or might be entirely folkloric, a story that expresses cultural anxieties about disappearance and the dangers of the northern environment through a fictional or heavily fictionalized event. The timing in 1930 places the alleged disappearance in a period of significant cultural disruption for Arctic indigenous peoples. Colonial authorities were increasingly asserting control. Traditional ways of life were being pressured by external forces. Disease and economic changes were affecting communities. In this context, communities might relocate suddenly to avoid census taking, to escape restrictions, to maintain autonomy from authorities they didn't trust. What appeared to a trapper as mysterious abandonment might have been deliberate evasion of colonial oversight, the community moving to a new location and intentionally leaving their old site in ways that would confuse outsiders. The lack of RCMP documentation is the most significant evidentiary problem. If an entire village disappeared under mysterious circumstances and a trapper reported it to police, there should be reports, investigation notes, outcome documentation, something in the historical record beyond the secondary and tertiary accounts that appeared in books and articles years after the alleged event. The absence of this documentation suggests either it was never properly investigated, which would indicate authorities didn't consider it mysterious because they had mundane explanation for the empty settlement, or the investigation records were lost or destroyed, or the investigation never happened because the report was never made, because Joe LaBelle himself might be a fictional or composite character, because the entire event might be fabrication or heavy embellishment of something far more mundane. But the story persists and continues to be retold precisely because it captures primal fears about disappearance, about communities ceasing to exist suddenly and inexplicably, about the wilderness swallowing people without trace or explanation. Whether it's historically accurate or not, it functions as modern mythology, as a narrative that expresses anxiety about how fragile human presence is in harsh environments, how quickly a functioning community can become ruins, how little trace we leave when we're removed from the landscape, how easily we can vanish if circumstances align against us. The comparison to other mass disappearance cases is inevitable. The Roanoke colony, where English settlers vanished, leaving only the cryptic carving Croatoan, is probably the most famous historical case of community disappearance. And while evidence suggests the colonists dispersed to live with indigenous populations, the mystery endures in popular consciousness as unexplained vanishing. The Mary Celeste, the ship found abandoned with no crew, despite being seaworthy and well supplied, represents maritime equivalent. These cases share characteristics with Anjikuni, people apparently abandoning possessions and safety without obvious reason, leaving environments that should contain them mysteriously empty. The difference is that Roanoke and Mary Celeste have contemporary documentation, have investigations that can be studied and analyzed, have physical evidence that researchers can examine. Anjikuni Lake, if it happened, has become filtered through decades of retelling without apparent access to primary sources, without ability to verify basic facts like population size or even which specific village was involved, making it more legend than history, more story than documented event. This doesn't prove it didn't happen. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly for events in remote locations involving marginalized populations whose experiences weren't always recorded by dominant culture. But it makes the case fundamentally different from disappearances where we have solid historical foundation. even if we don't have complete explanations. The modern investigations and research into Anji-kuni have produced ambiguous results. Some researchers claim to have found documentation supporting the basic facts. Others conclude the event was fabricated or grossly exaggerated. Still others argue that something happened, but that details have been so corrupted through retelling that reconstructing the actual event is impossible. The lack of consensus among researchers who've attempted to verify the case reflects the fundamental evidence problem. There isn't enough reliable primary source material to build definitive conclusions, leaving everyone to interpret the available fragmentary information through their own frameworks and biases. For believers in the paranormal or conspiratorial cover-ups, Anji-kuni Lake represents evidence of something extraordinary that was suppressed or ignored by authorities, that demonstrates reality contains threats or phenomena that official narratives don't acknowledge. For skeptics, it represents how legends develop, how stories get embellished through retelling, how lack of documentation allows speculation to flourish unchecked by facts. For those interested in indigenous history and colonial dynamics, it represents how indigenous experiences were often not recorded properly, how events in native communities might not receive investigation or documentation that similar events in settler communities would receive, how historical gaps and absences can be as revealing as what's documented. What remains is a story, powerful and disturbing, about an entire village that vanished from the northern wilderness, leaving behind their homes and possessions, and even their crucial survival equipment, disappearing so completely that no trace of them was found, no explanation emerged, no resolution ever came. Whether this story describes actual events in November 1930, or whether it's folklore that has been presented as history, the narrative endures because it touches something deep about human vulnerability, about how quickly we can vanish, about how the wilderness we imagine we control can reclaim us without warning, about how little may remain to mark our presence after we're gone. The empty village, the cold hearths, the starving dogs, the rifles left behind, the kayaks unused. These images carry weight regardless of their historical accuracy, because they represent the fragility of human settlement, the temporary nature of our occupation of hostile environments, the fact that we exist at the sufferance of forces we don't control, and that can remove us with terrifying completeness. Whether anyone actually vanished from Anji-kuni Lake, or whether the vanishing is itself a ghost story, a legend that emerged from the northern darkness to haunt those who hear it, the case serves as a reminder that the historical record is incomplete, that events in remote places involving marginalized peoples might not be documented in ways that satisfy modern evidentiary standards. That absence of clear evidence for extraordinary claims doesn't always mean the claims are false, but might mean the documentation was never done or has been lost or wasn't considered important enough to preserve. And so the village remains, in story, if not in fact, empty and mysterious on the shore of Anji-kuni Lake, waiting for explanation that may never come, waiting for the vanished inhabitants to return, or for investigators to finally determine what happened or didn't happen. Frozen in narrative perpetuity as the village that vanished completely, leaving only questions, only speculation, only the unsettling story of Joe LaBelle arriving to find everyone gone and nothing making sense, finding abandonment where community should be, finding silence where voices should carry, finding the terrible emptiness of a place where humans were but aren't anymore, where life was interrupted and never resumed, where 30 or 300 or 2,000 people ceased to exist in that location for reasons that remain, after more than 90 years, completely unexplained or completely fabricated, and we may never know which. Skinwalker Ranch, where reality stops making sense. There's a 512-acre property in Utah's Uinta Basin where the laws of physics appear to be optional, where phenomena from a dozen different paranormal categories occur simultaneously and without apparent pattern, where witnesses have documented cattle mutilations, UFO sightings, poltergeist activity, cryptid encounters, portal manifestations, time distortions, consciousness alterations, and technological anomalies with such frequency that the ranch has become one of the most studied locations in paranormal research. Yet it remains completely unexplained. Scientists with credentials from prestigious institutions have investigated it. The military has taken interest. Billionaires have purchased it specifically to fund research. And after decades of study involving everything from conventional instruments to exotic sensors, no one can adequately explain what happens there or why this particular piece of land seems to be a nexus point where multiple types of impossible phenomena converge and manifest with disturbing regularity. Whatever is occurring at Skinwalker Ranch defies categorization because it's not one phenomenon, but dozens. Not a single mystery, but a cascade of overlapping anomalies that suggest either the location is unique in ways that science doesn't understand, or that our entire framework for understanding reality is incomplete, that there are layers or systems operating in that space that render our normal rules of cause and effect temporarily suspended, creating an area where literally anything can happen and frequently does, where witnesses experience things that shouldn't be possible and then watch them disappear or transform before evidence can be properly documented, as if something is deliberately demonstrating that our understanding of how reality works is fundamentally flawed, and nowhere makes that clearer than this specific ranch in northeastern Utah, where reality itself seems to have stopped making sense. The modern documented history begins with the Sherman family, not their real name, used in early reports to protect privacy, who purchased the ranch in 1994, planning to run cattle and live quietly in rural Utah. Within days of moving in, they began experiencing phenomena that escalated from strange to terrifying with astonishing speed. They saw enormous wolves that seemed unaffected when shot at close range, animals that would walk up to the family, be hit with bullets that should have been lethal, and simply walk away without apparent injury or concern. Cattle were found mutilated in ways that matched classic cattle mutilation patterns. Organs removed with surgical precision, blood drained, cuts that appeared to be made with advanced technology, no footprints or evidence of human approach. Objects would move on their own, doors would lock and unlock, lights would appear in the sky, performing maneuvers that violated everything the Shermans knew about aircraft capabilities. The Shermans reported seeing what they could only describe as portals, apertures of light that would open in the air from which entities or craft would emerge before the opening closed and disappeared. They saw large craft hovering silently over the property, objects that would descend within feet of witnesses, emit no sound despite their size, and then accelerate away at speeds that should have created sonic booms but produced only silence. They heard voices speaking in the house when no one was there. Equipment would malfunction without explanation. Animals exhibited terror responses to things the humans couldn't perceive. And the overall atmosphere of the property shifted from ordinary ranch land to something that felt hostile and wrong, as if the space itself was aware and watching. The family lasted less than 2 years before the constant phenomena drove them to sell. Their neighbors had known about the ranch's reputation for decades. Navajo legends identified the area as cursed, as a place where skinwalkers, witches who can transform into animals, practiced dark magic, where the boundary between worlds was thin, where humans shouldn't spend extended time because the entities that lived there would notice and take interest. The Ute tribe, whose reservation borders the ranch property, considered it forbidden, a place of bad medicine that was to be avoided. The Shermans learned these warnings too late, after they'd already committed to the property and experienced enough to understand why locals stayed away. In 1996, businessman Robert Bigelow purchased the ranch through his National Institute for Discovery Science, an organization he'd created specifically to study anomalous phenomena. Bigelow brought in scientists, installed surveillance equipment, stationed observers continuously on the property, and began what would become years of documented investigation, attempting to understand what was happening there and why. The NIDS team collected enormous amounts of data, witnessed phenomena that multiple credible observers documented, experienced equipment failures, and technological interference that suggested active opposition to their investigation, and came away with conclusions that remain largely classified or unpublished. But that convinced Bigelow the ranch represented something genuinely extraordinary, something that exceeded his ability or resources to fully investigate or understand. The NIDS team reported similar phenomena to what the Shermans experienced, but with additional categories that emerged with systematic observation. They documented radiation spikes without identifiable sources, magnetic field anomalies that would appear and vanish without pattern, biological effects on observers that included missing time, sudden illness, psychological disturbances that would begin during ranch visits, and sometimes persist after leaving the property. Equipment would fail in ways that couldn't be explained mechanically. Cameras would malfunction when phenomena appeared. Recording devices would show battery drain that exceeded any normal rate, and in some cases the equipment would be found damaged in ways that suggested intentional interference rather than random failure. The phenomena seemed intelligent and responsive. When investigators set up to observe one area, activity would shift to different locations. When they deployed certain types of sensors, the phenomena would avoid those areas or would interact with the sensors in ways that produced data that was either useless or actively misleading. There was a sense of being toyed with, of something that was aware of the investigation and was either evading systematic study or was performing for the investigators, showing them things that would be disturbing or confusing, but never quite providing the clear evidence that would allow definitive conclusions. Witnesses described feeling watched constantly, having the impression that something was studying them as much as they were trying to study it. The cattle mutilations at Skinwalker Ranch share characteristics with the broader cattle mutilation phenomenon documented across the American West, but they occur with higher frequency and sometimes with additional anomalies. Animals have been found mutilated in locations they couldn't have reached on their own, positioned in ways that suggest they were moved after death, but with no tracks or evidence of how they were transported. The precision of the cuts, the apparent use of heat or tools that cauterize as they incise, the selective removal of specific organs while leaving others untouched, and the absence of blood despite living animals containing gallons, all suggest technology or techniques that aren't readily available and that serve purposes we can only speculate about. The cryptozoological elements include sightings of creatures that don't match known animals. The giant wolves that terrorized the Sherman family, creatures described as 7 or 8 feet tall when standing on hind legs, with massive heads and predatory intelligence that seemed to understand they were being threatened with weapons, but showed no fear or normal animal response patterns. Witnesses have reported humanoid figures, beings that appear human from a distance, but wrong upon closer observation. Entities that vanish when approached, or that seem to phase in and out of visibility. There are accounts of creatures that combine animal and human features, classic cryptid descriptions that match historical reports of skinwalkers and shapeshifters from indigenous traditions. The interdimensional hypothesis is frequently proposed because the range of phenomena suggests not a single source, but multiple types of manifestation, all occurring in the same location. If Skinwalker Ranch sits at a point where dimensional barriers are thin or compromised, where our reality overlaps with others more frequently or completely than elsewhere, then you'd expect exactly what's observed. Phenomena from multiple categories, entities and objects that phase in and out, physical laws that appear to suspend temporarily, consciousness effects that suggest our mental reality and external reality are interacting in unusual ways. The portals or apertures that witnesses describe would be literal openings between dimensions, allowing things from elsewhere to briefly enter our space before the opening closes. The government and military interest in Skinwalker Ranch is documented but largely classified. Bigelow had contracts with defense and intelligence agencies, and some of his ranch research was reportedly shared with these groups. After Bigelow sold the property in 2016 to an anonymous buyer, later revealed to be Brandon Fugel, a commercial real estate magnate, the new ownership continued systematic study with enhanced resources and brought in aerospace and defense industry expertise to analyze the phenomena. The current research involves sophisticated sensor arrays, multiple simultaneous observation methods, and teams attempting to actively provoke phenomena to occur on demand rather than waiting for random manifestations. The television series The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch documents some of the ongoing investigation, though skeptics note that reality TV formats incentivize drama and ambiguity over rigorous science. The show has documented unusual readings, unexplained occurrences, and events that seem to support the ranch's anomalous reputation. But the evidence presented is filtered through entertainment requirements and doesn't undergo the peer review or replication that scientific conclusions require. Still, the series has brought mainstream attention to the location and has added to the documented record of strange occurrences, even if the format makes it difficult to separate genuine anomaly from production manipulation or misinterpretation. The mesa that overlooks the ranch property is considered particularly active, with accounts of craft emerging from or disappearing into the mesa itself, as if it contains internal spaces or serves as a portal or base for whatever is generating the phenomena. Teams have attempted to access the interior of the mesa through ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing, finding anomalies in the readings that suggest cavities or structures that aren't accessible through normal means, or that perhaps exist in dimensional states that sensors can partially detect, but that can't be physically reached. Consciousness effects are among the most disturbing elements reported by investigators and visitors. People describe altered states while on the property, time distortions where minutes feel like hours, or vice versa, memories becoming confused or missing entirely for periods spent at the ranch. Some report lasting psychological effects, changes in perception or cognition that persist after leaving, as if exposure to whatever operates there created permanent alterations in how their consciousness functions. Whether these effects result from exotic energy fields, from direct mental manipulation by whatever intelligence operates the phenomena, or from trauma responses to experiencing things that violate their understanding of reality, remains unclear. The proximity to the Uinta Basin's unusual geology and the Ute Reservation has led to speculation about whether the location's properties are natural. Something about the geology or magnetic characteristics of the area creates conditions where anomalous phenomena occur more readily. The basin has high rates of UFO reports generally, making the ranch part of a broader regional pattern, rather than an isolated location. Whether the ranch is uniquely active within an already active region, or whether the concentrated observation and documentation there simply captures phenomena that occur throughout the basin but go unrecorded elsewhere, is difficult to determine. The lack of consistent patterns is itself a pattern. Phenomena don't repeat predictably, don't respond to experimental protocols in ways that allow systematic study, don't manifest on demand, even when researchers attempt to create conditions that previously correlated with activity. This suggests either the phenomena are random, which seems unlikely given the intelligence and responsiveness observers report, or they're controlled by something that deliberately avoids allowing systematic documentation. If the goal is to demonstrate that anomalies occur without allowing humans to understand or predict them, the ranch phenomena accomplish that perfectly. Skeptical explanations propose the ranch's reputation creates expectation effects, where observers interpret normal occurrences as paranormal, where ambiguous data gets coded as anomalous because that's what people are primed to see. The cattle mutilations might be predation or natural decomposition misinterpreted through sensationalist lens. The lights in the sky might be aircraft, drones, satellites, or atmospheric phenomena misidentified by witnesses primed to see UFOs. The equipment failures might be normal malfunction rates that seem significant because they're being interpreted as evidence of something anomalous. The missing time and altered states might be psychological responses to suggestion and the eerie atmosphere of a location that's been labeled as haunted or cursed. But this skeptical framework struggles with the multiplicity and consistency of witness reports, the caliber of some observers who've investigated the ranch, and the fact that phenomena occur even to skeptical investigators who arrive without belief in the paranormal. The NIDS team included PhD scientists who maintained skepticism throughout their investigation, yet documented occurrences they couldn't explain conventionally. Military and aerospace professionals who visited the ranch experienced things that challenged their frameworks despite their training and bias toward rational explanation. If the phenomena were purely psychological or misinterpretation, you'd expect that trained observers specifically looking for normal explanations would find them. Instead, they often become convinced that something genuinely anomalous is occurring. The question of whether Skinwalker Ranch is unique or simply well documented is significant. Other locations globally have similar reputations. Areas where multiple types of paranormal phenomena occur, where reality seems fluid, where witnesses experience things that defy conventional explanation. Skinwalker Ranch might represent an extreme example of something that occurs in degrees at multiple locations, places where for unknown reasons the normal rules loosen, and phenomena from various categories manifest more readily. If we could identify what makes these locations different, whether it's geology, electromagnetic characteristics, historical factors, or something else, we might understand not just Skinwalker Ranch, but the broader phenomenon of places where reality becomes permeable. The ranch continues to be studied, continues to produce reports of phenomena, continues to resist providing definitive answers, even as evidence accumulates. What happens there remains unexplained despite decades of investigation, despite sophisticated equipment, despite serious scientific effort applied by credible researchers. Either the phenomena are real and represent something about reality that science doesn't yet understand, or the entire thing is elaborate misinterpretation and expectation, creating a feedback loop that perpetuates itself through observer bias and media attention. But for those who've spent time there, who've witnessed the phenomena directly, who've experienced things that violated their understanding of what's possible, skepticism becomes harder to maintain. When you see objects that shouldn't be able to fly, when you experience time distortions and missing memory, when equipment fails in your hands, and creatures that shouldn't exist walk through your field of vision, dismissing it as misinterpretation requires ignoring your direct experience in favor of maintaining a worldview where such things can't happen. Skinwalker Ranch stands as a challenge to consensus reality, a specific location where the extraordinary occurs with enough frequency that it can't be dismissed as isolated incidents or individual delusion, where multiple witness categories have documented multiple phenomena types, where investigation continues because the questions remain unanswered and the activity continues. Whether it's a window into dimensions we don't normally access, whether it's a base or observation point for non-human intelligence, whether it's a natural anomaly where physics works differently because of unique local conditions, or whether it's simply a place that's become a focal point for human projection and expectation. Creating the appearance of phenomena through psychological and sociological processes. Rather than objective anomaly, Skinwalker Ranch endures as one of the most documented and least understood locations in paranormal research. Reality stops making sense there, or perhaps more accurately, reality reveals that it never made as much sense as we thought it did, that the rules we assume are constant and universal might actually be local and conditional, that there are places where different rules apply, or where multiple realities overlap, and that Skinwalker Ranch happens to be one of those places, 512 acres in Utah, where anything can happen and frequently does, where the impossible occurs so regularly that it becomes almost expected, where witnesses arrive skeptical and leave uncertain, where investigation produces data but not understanding, where the mysteries multiply faster than explanations can contain them, where reality itself seems to be performing, demonstrating, showing us that the world is far stranger than our frameworks allow, that consciousness and matter and time and space interact in ways we don't comprehend, and that sometimes, in certain places, under certain conditions, the veil gets thin enough that we can see through to the other side, can glimpse what's always there but usually hidden, can experience reality without the filters and limitations that normally keep us safely confined to the narrow band of perception that makes the universe seem comprehensible and predictable, leaving Skinwalker Ranch as a permanent question mark on the landscape, a challenge to every certainty, a place where reality stops pretending to make sense and reveals itself as something far more complex, far more fluid, far more utterly strange than anything our science or philosophy has properly accounted for, waiting there in northeastern Utah for the next investigator who thinks they'll be the one to finally explain it, to finally solve the mystery, to finally make sense of the place where sense doesn't apply, where reality plays by different rules, where anything is possible because the normal constraints that prevent the impossible from occurring have somehow, for reasons we still don't understand, been suspended. The borehole that recorded screams from hell. In 1989, a story began circulating through Christian newsletters, evangelical radio programs, and missionary networks claiming that Soviet scientists drilling the Kola Super Deep borehole, a real scientific project that had penetrated deeper into Earth's crust than any previous drilling operation, reaching depths of over 12 kilometers, had broken through into a massive underground cavity, and upon lowering temperature-resistant microphones into the opening, had recorded sounds that could only be described as millions of human voices screaming in agony. The unmistakable sounds of souls suffering in hell. The scientists, according to the story, were atheist communists who didn't believe in God or the afterlife, but the audio they captured was so disturbing, so clearly the screams of the damned, that some of them fled the project in terror, unable to reconcile what they'd heard with their materialist worldview, unable to deny that they had accidentally drilled into the actual underworld, into the biblical hell where condemned souls suffer eternal torment, and that their instruments had recorded proof that the ancient religious texts were literally true, that beneath our feet, just 12 kilometers down through the Earth's crust, the domain of Satan and the suffering dead actually exists not as metaphor or spiritual realm, but as physical location accessible through sufficiently deep excavation. The story included details that gave it credibility, the specific location in Russia's Kola Peninsula, the depth of 12 kilometers, which matched real data from the actual borehole project. Quotes, attributed to Dr. Azakoff, the alleged chief scientist who reportedly said the project was terminated because what they discovered was too terrifying to continue investigating. And most compellingly, the claimed audio recording itself, which circulated on cassette tapes and later online, several seconds of chaotic screaming and wailing that sounded like thousands of voices in torment, allegedly captured by scientific instruments deployed into the cavity they'd breached. The story spread rapidly through Christian communities, appearing in magazines and newsletters, being repeated from pulpits, shared as testimony to the reality of hell and the truth of Scripture, becoming so widespread that it was treated as established fact by significant portions of evangelical Christianity, despite immediately raising questions about its authenticity, despite the obvious problems with the narrative, despite the lack of verification from any legitimate news sources or scientific institutions, despite eventually being thoroughly debunked as hoax, as deliberate fabrication created by combining real details about the Kola borehole with fictional elements and manufactured audio, yet persisting decades later in conspiracy theory communities and fundamentalist circles, where it continues to be cited as evidence that hell is real and located in the Earth's interior, and that scientists accidentally proved this in 1989 before suppressing the discovery, making the sounds from hell one of the most successful religious urban legends of modern times, a story that either documents the most significant theological and scientific discovery in human history, or documents how easily fabricated stories can spread when they tell people what they want to believe, when they confirm existing religious convictions about the reality of hell and divine judgment, leaving the well-to-hell story hovering between testified to fact and demonstrated hoax, between evidence of literal hell and evidence of human gullibility, between proof that spiritual realms have physical locations and proof that conspiracy theories and religious legends can survive debunking indefinitely if the audience has sufficient motivation to believe them. The Kola super deep borehole is real. It exists on the Kola Peninsula in northwestern Russia, was drilled between 1970 and 1994 as scientific research project studying the Earth's crust, and reached a depth of 12,262 meters, making it the deepest artificial point on Earth until exceeded by oil wells, using different drilling techniques in later decades. The project was legitimate science, investigating deep geology, testing theories about crustal composition, studying seismic discontinuities, and gathering data about Earth's interior that couldn't be obtained through surface observation. The borehole hit unexpectedly high temperatures at depth, over 180 degrees Celsius at 12 kilometers, which exceeded predictions and eventually made further drilling impractical because conventional drill bits couldn't function in those conditions. The project was closed in 1994 for economic and technical reasons following the Soviet Union's collapse, not because they discovered hell. The well-to-hell story appears to have originated with a Finnish Christian newsletter in 1989, which published an article claiming the discovery had occurred and that scientists had been terrified by what they found. The story was then picked up by Trinity Broadcasting Network in the United States, where it was broadcast on Christian television and spread rapidly through evangelical communities. The supposed scientist, Dr. Azakoff, appears to be fictional. No records of a geologist or seismologist by that name associated with the Kola project exist. The quotes attributed to him have never been verified in any Soviet scientific publication or documentation from the actual project. The audio recording that supposedly captures the screams from hell has been analyzed and appears to be fabricated from multiple sources. Audio forensics suggests it's a composite of horror movie sound effects, manipulated recordings of crowds, and possibly animal sounds processed to sound human-like, layered together to create chaotic screaming that doesn't have the acoustic characteristics of sound recorded in the specific environmental conditions that would exist in a deep borehole. The recording also doesn't match what would be captured by the temperature-resistant microphones that would have been used in actual deep Earth research. Such equipment would produce very different audio quality and frequency response than what appears in the circulated recording. The physics of the claimed discovery are problematic. Sound requires a medium to travel, typically air, and the cavity described in the story would need to be enormous and filled with air at depth, which is geologically implausible. The temperatures and pressures at 12 kilometers depth would make any air-filled cavity impossible to maintain, and any sounds generated at that depth would be transmitted through rock as seismic waves rather than as airborne audio that could be recorded by conventional microphones. The entire scenario is incompatible with what we know about Earth's interior structure and the physical behavior of sound. The theological implications of the story are also problematic from within Christian frameworks. Biblical descriptions of hell typically don't locate it as physical cavity in Earth's crust, but rather as spiritual realm or as metaphorical description of separation from God. Most theological traditions understand hell as existing outside physical space-time rather than as accessible through geological drilling. The story's literal interpretation, hell as physical location 12 kilometers below surface, represents folk theology rather than scholarly religious understanding, appealing to fundamentalist literalism that reads scriptural metaphors as physical descriptions. Yet the story persists. Decades after being debunked, after the fabrication has been documented, after the audio has been shown to be fake, and the scientists shown to be fictional, and the entire narrative demonstrated to be hoax, the Well to Hell story continues to circulate. It appears in conspiracy theory compilations, gets shared on social media, is presented in fundamentalist Christian contexts as evidence of hell's reality, is cited by people who either don't know it's been debunked or who reject the debunking as part of atheist or scientific conspiracy to suppress evidence of the spiritual realm. This persistence reveals something about how belief systems interact with information. For people whose religious identity and worldview depend on hell being literally real, a story claiming scientific proof of hell's existence is powerfully attractive, confirms what they already believe, provides evidence they can cite when challenged by skeptics. Once accepted into their belief system, the story becomes resistant to correction because rejecting it would require acknowledging they were fooled, would weaken their ability to argue for their religious positions, would remove a piece of evidence they've been using to support their faith. The mechanism of debunking resistance involves motivated reasoning and source credibility judgments. If someone believes the story is true and it's important to their worldview, they're motivated to find reasons to reject debunking attempts. They can question the credibility of skeptical sources. Scientists and fact-checkers might be lying to suppress religious truth. They can argue that absence of verification doesn't prove the story is false. Records might have been destroyed or suppressed. The scientist might have used a pseudonym for safety. The audio might be authentic even if its provenance can't be established. As long as the story can't be definitively disproven to their satisfaction, and what would constitute definitive disproof to someone sufficiently motivated to believe, they can continue accepting it. The Well to Hell story also functions as modern folklore, as urban legend that serves cultural purposes beyond its truth value. It expresses anxiety about scientific materialism, about the erosion of religious certainty in modern secular societies, about the fear that science is trying to eliminate God and the spiritual realm from human understanding. The story pushes back against this, suggests that even atheist scientists conducting secular research can't escape divine reality, that hell exists whether they believe in it or not, that their instruments will record spiritual truth even when their minds refuse to acknowledge it. It's revenge fantasy for religious believers who feel marginalized by scientific authority. A story where the scientists are forced to confront that they were wrong, that the religious were right all along, that reality includes the spiritual dimensions that materialism denies. The comparison to other false stories that persist despite debunking is instructive. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion continues to circulate despite being proven fabricated anti-Semitic propaganda. Moon landing denial persists despite overwhelming evidence the landings occurred. Flat Earth belief exists despite trivial ability to demonstrate Earth's sphericity. In each case, the false narrative serves psychological or ideological needs for believers that truth-based correction can't address. The well-to-hell story similarly serves needs: validation of religious belief, confirmation of hell's reality, evidence to use in evangelism, that make it valuable regardless of its factual status. The ethical dimension involves whether sharing known false stories is justified if it serves religious purposes. Some who spread the well-to-hell story know it's fabricated, but argue that if it brings people to faith, if it makes hell's reality vivid and motivates repentance, then the deception is justified as noble lie, as tool for achieving greater spiritual truth, even through factual falsehood. Others argue this is deeply problematic, that faith built on false testimony is compromised, that when the falsehood is revealed, it undermines credibility of religious claims generally, that truth matters intrinsically, and using lies to promote religious belief is self-defeating and ethically wrong. The original fabricator's motives remain unclear. Was it deliberate hoax intended to fool credulous believers, prank, or social experiment to see how quickly false story would spread through religious communities? Was it sincere but mistaken belief by someone who combined fragmentary information about the Cola Project with religious imagination, creating story they believed might be true, and sharing it without adequate verification? Was it evangelical tool, fabrication intended to serve faith by making hell vivid and real to audiences that might be wavering in belief? The anonymity of early internet and newsletter distribution means the original source can't be identified and interviewed to determine intent. The lesson extends beyond this specific hoax to questions about how we evaluate extraordinary claims. The well-to-hell story contained verifiable elements. The Kola borehole existed, reached the claimed depth, was Soviet scientific project, mixed with unverifiable elements: the cavity, the recording, the scientist's quotes, the project cancellation reason. This mixing of real and false details is characteristic of successful hoaxes, making the story seem plausible enough to avoid immediate dismissal, while the unverifiable elements carry the actual extraordinary claims. Effective fact-checking requires not just verifying that some details are accurate, but checking whether the extraordinary claims specifically are supported by credible evidence, which in this case they weren't. The scientific response to the story has been consistent dismissal. Geologists and seismologists have repeatedly explained why the claimed discovery is physically impossible, why the audio couldn't be authentic, why the scenario violates known facts about Earth's interior. But scientific authority doesn't persuade audiences that distrust science or that believe scientists are part of atheist conspiracy to suppress religious truth. The expertise that makes scientists credible sources on geological questions is exactly what makes them suspect sources for believers who think scientific materialism is fundamentally wrong about spiritual reality. Whether hell exists as spiritual reality, as state of separation from God, as metaphorical description of suffering, or doesn't exist at all, the well-to-hell story doesn't provide evidence for any of these positions because the story itself is fabricated, the audio is fake, the scientist is fictional, and the claimed events didn't occur. The Kola Super Deep borehole is impressive engineering and valuable science, But it didn't drill into hell because hell as physical cavity in Earth's crust doesn't exist. Because screams don't travel through rock at 12-kilometer depths in ways that could be recorded by microphones. Because the temperature and pressure conditions make the entire scenario impossible, leaving the well to hell as what it is. Successful religious hoax that continues circulating decades after debunking because it tells story that significant audience wants to believe, that confirms their religious worldview, that provides them with narrative and evidence they find useful despite its falsity, making it case study in how misinformation persists, not through lack of debunking, but through motivated belief, through audience that needs the story to be true more than they need truth, through communities that value the story's religious utility over its factual accuracy, leaving the well-to-hell story permanently circulating through fundamentalist Christianity and conspiracy theory networks, where it will continue appearing as testimony, as evidence, as proof of hell's reality. Despite being none of those things, despite being demonstrated fabrication, despite the Kola borehole, scientists never recording screams, never breaking into cavity, never fleeing in terror from proof of hell, because none of that happened, because the story is false, because the sounds from hell were created in recording studio or assembled from sound effects library, not captured by instruments deployed into Earth's crust, not transmitted from suffering souls, not evidence of anything except human capacity to create and spread false stories when those stories serve psychological or religious purposes that make truth secondary to utility, leaving the well to hell hovering as it always has between repeated claim and demonstrated falsehood, between testimonial and hoax, between evidence believers. Sight and fabrication skeptics document existing in permanent tension between communities that need it to be true and research that proves it isn't, between faith that wants scientific confirmation and science that doesn't provide it, between the story and the reality, between the claimed recording of screams from hell and the actual silence of the Kola super deep borehole that penetrated 12 kilometers into Earth's crust and found not souls in torment, but only rock and heat, and the geological processes that our planet has conducted for billions of years without supernatural intervention, without spiritual realms accessible through drilling, without hell waiting in the depths to be discovered by Soviet scientists, leaving only the borehole itself as monument to human engineering and scientific curiosity, and the story of screams from hell as monument to human credulity and religious imagination, to our capacity to create legends that outlive debunking, that persist through sheer determination of belief, that continue spreading despite being false because they serve purposes that don't require truth, that exist in spaces where factual accuracy matters less than psychological utility, where stories function regardless of whether they describe actual events, where the well to hell remains eternally both claimed and disproven, both testified to and debunked, both evidence and fabrication, depending on who's telling it, who's listening, and whether truth or belief matters more in that particular moment, that particular community, that particular conversation about whether hell is real and whether science proved it in 1989, when Soviet scientists allegedly drilled too deep and heard the screams that confirmed ancient religious truth, or heard nothing except the natural processes of Earth's interior. Because the story never happened, was always false, remains demonstrably fabricated, yet continues its own form of eternal persistence, not in hell, but in the infinite circulation of internet and belief, where false stories never quite die, never quite get fully rejected, always find new audiences who haven't heard the debunking or who choose not to accept it, keeping the well-to-hell story alive decades after its creation, decades after its refutation, permanently suspended between claim and fact, between testimony and hoax, between the recording that supposedly captured hell and the silence that actually exists 12 kilometers beneath. The surface where the Kola borehole reached, and where scientists found exactly what geology predicted, and nothing that Scripture claimed, nothing supernatural, nothing spiritual, nothing that would support the story that nonetheless continues spreading, continues being believed, continues functioning as modern legend regardless of its relationship to truth. The chronovisor, Vatican technology to see through time. In the archives of the Vatican, behind layers of security and classification that protect some of the world's oldest and most sensitive documents, there allegedly exists a device that represents one of the most extraordinary technological achievements in human history, if it exists at all. It's called the chronovisor, and according to claims made by a Benedictine monk named Father Pellegrino Ernetti in the 1960s, this machine can view events from the past by receiving, decoding, and reconstructing electromagnetic radiation that those events emitted, effectively turning history into something that can be witnessed rather than merely studied through artifacts and texts. Ernetti claimed to have been part of a team of scientists who built the device, claimed to have used it to witness crucifixion of Christ, to see Napoleon giving speeches, to watch performances of lost Greek plays, to observe moments from history that were previously accessible only through fragmentary accounts and conflicting testimonies. If true, the chronovisor represents technology that could revolutionize history, theology, archaeology, and our understanding of time itself. If false, if Ernetti fabricated the entire story, the question becomes why a respected religious scholar would create such an elaborate hoax, what he hoped to achieve, and whether perhaps his claims contain elements of truth wrapped in exaggeration or misdirection. Whether the chronovisor exists in some form, even if not exactly as he described it. Whether the Vatican possesses capabilities related to temporal observation that remain classified for reasons that go beyond simple technological secrecy into territory involving faith, theology, and the profound disruptions that proof of past events would create if historical and religious narratives could be verified or contradicted through direct observation. Father Pellegrino Ernetti was a respected figure, not a fringe character prone to wild claims. He was a scholar, a musician specializing in ancient music, an exorcist recognized by the church, and a person whose position and reputation would normally insulate him from accusations of fabrication or delusion. His claims about the chronovisor emerged in interviews in the 1960s and 70s, described with specificity that suggested either genuine experience or remarkably detailed imagination. He claimed the device was built in the 1950s by a team that included Enrico Fermi, the renowned physicist, and Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist, along with other scientists whose names Ernetti provided, but whose involvement has never been verified through independent sources. The operating principle Ernetti described relies on the premise that all events emit electromagnetic radiation and sound waves that travel outward from their point of origin, and, under certain interpretations of physics, never completely dissipate, but rather become increasingly dispersed and degraded as they propagate through space. The chronovisor supposedly could locate, capture, and reconstruct these ancient radiations, bringing together the scattered photons and sound waves from historical events and reassembling them into coherent images and sounds that could be viewed and heard by operators. This would be extraordinarily sophisticated signal processing, requiring the ability to distinguish the specific radiation from a particular event from the overwhelming noise of all other radiation in the environment, to account for dispersion and interference across centuries, and to reconstruct from fragmentary data a viewable representation of what occurred. The theoretical possibility of such technology depends on interpretations of physics that aren't mainstream but aren't entirely impossible. If information is conserved in ways we don't fully understand, If the past creates imprints in space-time or in quantum fields that persist and could be accessed with sufficiently advanced sensors and processing, then something like the chronovisor might be achievable. But conventional physics suggests that electromagnetic radiation disperses according to inverse square law, meaning that signals from ancient events would be so attenuated and so mixed with cosmic background radiation and other sources that extracting usable information would be effectively impossible with any conceivable technology. Ernetti's most dramatic claim involved witnessing the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He described the scene in detail, claimed to have witnessed the events of Good Friday, and said the experience had profound emotional and spiritual impact on him. He provided descriptions of Christ's appearance, the language spoken, details of the execution that he claimed matched historical understanding, but that he insisted came from direct observation through the chronovisor. For the Catholic Church, verification of the crucifixion through direct observation would have immense theological implications, providing physical evidence for the foundational event of Christianity, while simultaneously raising disturbing questions about whether the past should be observed, whether some events are sacred and should remain known only through faith rather than through technological voyeurism. The Vatican's response to Ernetti's claims was notably restrained. They didn't denounce him as a fraud, didn't defrock him, or censure him officially, but they also didn't confirm or acknowledge the existence of the chronovisor. This ambiguous response has fueled speculation that the Church knows more than it's saying, that perhaps the device exists, but the Church has chosen to classify and suppress it for theological and practical reasons. If historical events can be viewed directly, it would destabilize both religious certainty and historical scholarship, creating conflicts where direct observation contradicts accepted narratives, where faith becomes testable and potentially falsifiable, where every contentious historical question, from Christ's resurrection to the details of various miracles, could theoretically be investigated through temporal viewing. The photograph that Ernetti provided as evidence significantly damaged his credibility. He claimed it was an image of Christ captured through the chronovisor during the crucifixion, showing Jesus' face in profile. When researchers investigated, they discovered the image matched a postcard sold at the Sanctuary of Merciful Love in Collevalenza, Italy, showing a wooden relief sculpture. Ernetti claimed the postcard creators had copied the chronovisor image, but most concluded that Ernetti had simply photographed the relief and presented it as chronovisor output. This apparent fraud cast doubt on his entire narrative. If he faked this evidence, perhaps the entire chronovisor story was fabrication. But Ernetti never recanted his claims, even as evidence against them accumulated. On his deathbed in 1994, he maintained that the chronovisor was real, that he had indeed seen the past through it, though he allegedly told a colleague that not everything he had said about it was accurate, a cryptic admission that might mean he embellished, or might mean he had been forced to include disinformation in his public accounts to protect classified aspects of the project. The composition of the alleged team raises questions. Fermi and von Braun were both brilliant scientists with expertise in physics and engineering that could theoretically apply to exotic technology development, but both died. Fermi in 1954 and von Braun in 1977, with no public acknowledgement of involvement in temporal viewing technology. If they were involved, it would have been deeply classified work that they took to their graves. Or they were not involved, and Ernetti invoked their names to add credibility to a fabrication, knowing that the dead couldn't contradict him. The conspiracy theory that has developed around the chronovisor proposes several possibilities. Perhaps the device exists, but was found to be too dangerous or too disruptive to use or acknowledge. And Ernetti's public statements were designed to be partially discredited so that the existence of the actual technology could be hidden behind the facade of debunked claims. Perhaps it was built but didn't work as hoped, producing ambiguous images that couldn't be verified and that therefore couldn't serve any practical purpose. Perhaps it worked too well, revealing things about history and theology that powerful institutions decided must remain hidden, and Ernetti was silenced or contained, his claims dismissed as fraud to prevent further investigation. The Vatican secret archives contain countless documents and artifacts spanning 2 millennia, many of which remain classified and inaccessible to outside researchers. If the chronovisor exists, the archives would be the logical place to keep it, along with whatever records or observations the device produced. The Church's documented history of suppressing or controlling information it deems dangerous or premature for public knowledge makes it plausible that extraordinary technology could be kept secret if its existence conflicted with theological or political interests. The parallel to the Akashic records of esoteric tradition is worth noting. Various spiritual and mystical systems describe a cosmic library or field where all events and knowledge are stored and can be accessed by those with proper training or capability. The chronovisor would be the technological implementation of this concept, a device that accesses what mystical traditions claim to access through consciousness and spiritual practice. Whether these traditions are describing something real that Ernetti's team found a technological path to, or whether Ernetti was drawing on these traditions to create a plausible-sounding mechanism for his fabricated device, the conceptual overlap is significant. The ethical implications of temporal viewing technology are profound and largely unexplored in Ernetti's accounts. If the past can be viewed, questions of privacy, consent, and the sanctity of personal and historical moments become relevant. Do the dead have rights to privacy? Do sacred events lose their sacred character when they're reduced to observable phenomena? Does viewing the past change it through observer effects? Or is observation purely passive? If conflicts in historical understanding can be resolved through direct viewing, who decides what's viewed and what remains uncertain? Would religious faith survive if miracles could be verified or falsified through technological observation? The technology, if it exists, would have obvious intelligence and military applications beyond historical scholarship. Observing enemy planning in the recent past, verifying or contradicting testimony in legal proceedings, investigating unsolved crimes by viewing what actually occurred. The strategic value would be immense. This alone might justify keeping it classified, regardless of any theological concerns. A nation possessing working temporal viewing technology would have intelligence capabilities that eclipse any conventional espionage or surveillance, able to see what happened without needing infiltration or interception, limited only by the spatial resolution and temporal range of the device. The question of why Ernetti would fabricate such claims if the chronovisor doesn't exist produces various theories. Perhaps he genuinely believed in the concept and created false evidence because he couldn't build the device, but wanted to manifest the idea, believing that publicly claiming it existed might inspire actual development. Perhaps he was experimenting with memetics, with how ideas spread and persist, using the chronovisor as a thought experiment that he presented as reality to study reactions. Perhaps he had psychological or spiritual experiences that he interpreted as viewing the past and genuinely believed they were real, translating mystical or imaginal visions into a technological framework that made sense to his scientific era. Or perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between fabrication and reality. Perhaps early research into temporal viewing produced ambiguous results, unclear images, or data that might have been from the past, but might have been artifacts or noise. And Ernetti extrapolated from these preliminary results to make dramatic claims that exceeded what the technology could actually demonstrate. Perhaps he was part of research that was classified, and his public claims were cover stories or partial disclosures, mixing truth and disinformation in ways that would allow him to speak about his work while protecting its actual capabilities and status. The concept has entered popular culture and conspiracy theory as one of those persistent stories that can't be definitively disproven, because absence of evidence is an evidence of absence when dealing with allegedly classified technology. The chronovisor joins other supposed Vatican secrets. The third secret of Fatima, hidden archives containing evidence that would shake Christianity, technologies, or knowledge inherited from previous civilizations. As part of a narrative where the church possesses extraordinary information or capabilities that it keeps from the world for theological or political purposes. Whether the chronovisor exists as anything more than an idea, whether Father Ernetti witnessed the past through technology or through imagination or through some mystical experience he misunderstood as technological. The concept endures because it addresses fundamental human desires to witness history directly, to resolve uncertainties, to see rather than to merely believe or deduce. The past is lost to us except through the fragmentary evidence it left behind. Artifacts, texts, effects that persisted. The possibility of directly observing what happened, of seeing history rather than reconstructing it, of knowing with certainty rather than probability, is powerfully appealing even as it raises troubling questions about whether some things should remain in the past, whether observation would contaminate or desecrate what it reveals, whether faith and historical interpretation serve purposes that direct knowledge would destroy. The chronovisor remains what it has been since Ernetti first described it, an unverified claim, an extraordinary assertion without extraordinary evidence, a story that could be complete fabrication or could be partial truth about technology that exists, but that remains hidden behind Vatican walls. Locked away in those secret archives where so much else that the church wants contained allegedly resides. Waiting perhaps for a future where humanity is ready to face what the past would reveal. If we could see it directly, if we could point a device at history and watch it unfold before our eyes, confirming or contradicting everything we've believed based on incomplete evidence and faith-based interpretations, making history something we witness rather than something we study, turning the past from a distant abstraction into something as observable as the present. If only we had the technology, if only someone would confirm it exists, if only the Vatican would unlock its archives and reveal what Father Pellegrino Ernetti really saw or didn't see, what he really built or didn't build, whether the chronovisor is technological marvel or elaborate hoax or something in between, that's more complicated than either simple acceptance or simple dismissal can capture, leaving us, as we've always been, left with claims about Vatican secrets, wondering, speculating, unable to prove or disprove, certain only that if such technology exists, if the past can be viewed and recorded and studied directly, the institutions that possess it have chosen not to share, have chosen to keep it hidden for reasons we can only guess at, reasons that might involve protecting faith or protecting power or protecting humanity from knowledge that we're not ready to process, leaving the chronovisor as one more legend, one more rumor, one more story about technology too powerful to acknowledge, too dangerous to use, too important to destroy. Locked away where only a select few might access it, watching history unfold through a screen that bridges time itself, seeing what was, and perhaps, if the technology works in both directions as some theories propose, seeing what will be, making the Vatican not just the keeper of religious tradition, but potentially the keeper of humanity's entire timeline, past and future, visible through a device that most believe doesn't exist, but that some insist does, that Father Ernetti swore on his deathbed was real. That remains one of history's tantalizing mysteries. Did he see through time, or did he simply see what he wanted to see and convince himself it came from a device that never existed except in his imagination, giving us a legend that endures because we want it to be true, want to believe that somewhere, somehow, someone can see the past as it actually was, can witness history directly, can know with certainty what happened in moments that have vanished into time, leaving only the chronovisor claim, hovering between proven false and possibly true, a Schrodinger's device that exists and doesn't exist until someone opens the Vatican archives and shows us either the machine itself or the definitive proof that it was never anything more than one monk's remarkable imagination, one scholar's elaborate deception, or one mystic's genuine experience translated into scientific language that his era could understand, leaving the question unresolved, leaving the mystery intact, leaving us still wondering whether the Vatican can see through time and whether they've been watching history all along from their position outside it, recording, observing, knowing, while the rest of us struggle with fragments and faith and the permanent uncertainty of a past that refuses to reveal itself completely. No matter how much we dig or analyze or wish, we could simply watch what actually happened and know, finally know, what the truth is behind the legends, behind the texts, behind the centuries of history that we've reconstructed from pieces when perhaps, somewhere in Vatican City, there's a screen showing it all directly, showing the past as it was, making history into something that can be verified rather than debated. If only the chronovisor is real, if only it exists, if only Father Ernetti was telling the truth.